I'm Red Idaho. Hello and welcome to the first episode of our new web series, Political Myths Debunked, where we will talk with our panel about religion, economics, war, and peace, and everything in between. Today we will talk about gun control and whether the state should confiscate all weapons or we should all join the NRA. What could go wrong? We will assign to our guests the titles of In Favor of Less Regulation, In Favor of More Regulation. And so now it is my great pleasure to introduce our magnificent, eloquent, and gracious panelists, Thaddeus Von Gilder and David Sinemak. David Sinemak, we can argue for less regulation. So David, I assume it is safe to assume that you are against any and all possible forms of tyrannical control over my rights and any contrivance of big government to limit the pursuit of even higher rounds per minute will just as soon have the federal government police knocking at your door and the rest of us marching in lockstep into the gates of hell. And Thaddeus, of course I assume that you're merely a lone voice of reason, the small Dutch boy with your finger in the proverbial dam holding back the unstoppable and horrific free-for-all shoot-'em-up gallery that our great country would inevitably become if even a single backwoods Bubba Ray or Bojangles got his greasy hands on an unstoppable death machine such as an AR-15. Every man, woman, and child would be packing heat and living in perpetual fear, sporadically interrupted by violent and unpredictable talk. Now, any educated and rational person will of course realize the patent ridiculousness of these stereotypes and the great disservice they do us. And so without any further ado or incoherent ramblings on the part of myself, please let's see if we can get to the bottom of this whole business. David, we will start with you, cowboy.
Thank you, Red, and thank you to the College Independence for having us. As I think you humorously pointed out, this whole controversy has really been choked up by the media into a series of ridiculous stereotypes. The first thing that I want to point out is that I am in favor of regulation of firearms. They, like any dangerous consumer product, must be subject to some rules and regulation. But here's the problem, Red. We already have incredible amounts of government regulation dealing with firearms. And please understand that much of this regulation is good. However, an equal amount of it is ineffective, outdated, or overly restrictive to otherwise law-abiding citizens. But before we get into that, I would like to establish a key principle, which is the consumer demand and black markets. Take any heavily demanded product. Now inflate the price greatly or ban it entirely. What is the result? Does the demand disappear? Of course not. But all we have managed to do is push the market underground and give the production and distribution over to criminals. Of course, guns are not as easy to produce as narcotics, but it is quite easy to convert traditional weapons into assault weapons, and these amateur products are obviously significantly more unsafe than manufactured rifles. This has happened time and time again with alcohol, with marijuana, even with digital music. Guns are one of the most popular consumer products in the United States, and the same will happen with them. Not only would they be unsafely produced by underground operations, it would also increase smuggling from Canada and Mexico. Finally, firearm production is a huge American industry and employs hundreds of thousands of American workers. So when I hear people say things like, let's ban all semi-automatic firearms, I get a little discouraged. First of all, nearly every modern firearm can be considered semi-automatic. Automation of the firing mechanism of a rifle makes it more efficient, more humane to game animals, and not to mention more fun. So why are firearms so popular? Well, for hundreds of reasons. Firstly, a firearm is an extremely effective tool for self and home defense. No criminal is going to be deterred by a 911 call and a police officer 20 minutes away like they will be by a 12-gauge. Secondly, firearms are tools used by thousands of sportsmen for harvesting game animals. Why is hunting valuable or important in our society? Other than being fun and good exercise, hunting reduces overpopulation of animals such as white-tailed deer, which should otherwise be hit by motorists, become a nuisance to farmers, and often deplete their food supply to an extent that they starve to death in large numbers. Secondly, exotic hunting resorts have single-handedly been the reason for the survival and eventual resurgence of a variety of endangered species. Hunters are some of the most responsible and active environmentalists in the country. Finally, firearms are an enjoyable recreational sport. Target shooting is an Olympic sport and very popular in the United States. It is proven to increase hand-eye coordination and to relieve stress. These are all reasons why we cannot and should not ban any type of firearm other than those that are not highly demanded by the market. and being used for any of the above purposes. All that being said, we do need to have some sensible gun regulation to prevent consumers from harming themselves and others, as well as to keep track of and prevent firearms from being sold to criminals. But let's look at current regulations. In most states, firearms do need to be licensed before being sold. Secondly, most states do require a safety course and licensing before being allowed to hunt or shoot at ranges. These are good laws that we need to strengthen. Finally, we need to have a sensible talk about moving the use of the most dangerous types of firearms, such as automatic weapons, into approved locations only, similar to the way you cannot drink alcohol in the middle of the street. We contain drinking to bars. However, most of our gun regulation is not effective. Regardless of laws against assault rifles, gun enthusiasts continue to modify and create their own weapons, and thousands of weapons still end up in the hands of those who use them illegally. Making these laws universal will not make them any more effective. The distinction between assault rifles and modern hunting rifles is trivial, and banning them will not put a stop to the real hot-and-button issue of mass shootings. So let's address this issue of mass shootings. And first, let's look at the facts. These shootings nearly always take place in gun-free zones, often in states with some of the most restrictive gun laws in place already. The Colorado shooter specifically chose his theater based on its restriction on firearms. The real issue in most of these instances is the way in which our society creates and deals with psychologically disturbed individuals. Where is the honest discussion about our drug and chug approach to dealing with mental illness? Why do we still educate children in the exact same ways that we did in 1900? Secondly, we have a problem with an out-of-control media. The entire purpose of these shootings is to become legendary and make the shooter infamous. The media plays into this hook, line, and sinker. Again, this is not today's topic, but this calls for a more reasoned discussion on the plague of reporters who descend like vultures on any hint of violence, especially violence involving children.
Well, thank you, David, and thank you for giving us your opinions on the topic. Now we're going to turn over to Mr. Thaddeus, and you're going to give us your opinion.
Well, Dave, I'm glad we can agree on some things then. It seems that we're both sensible people, and neither of us is for a completely unregulated weapons market, or for the complete abolishment of guns in our culture. Where we disagree is on the amount of regulation required to keep us and our families safe. It is true that making certain products illegal may cause a black market for those products if the demand for them is high enough. Could this happen if an assault weapons ban were put into place? Yes. But there are many factors that would make a black market for assault rifles much less prevalent or successful than, say, a marijuana black market. First, unlike illicit drugs, assault weapons are very complicated pieces of machinery. While anyone can grow marijuana in their pot or in their basement or backyard, assault rifles require advanced manufacturing equipment and procedures to create. What an assault weapons ban would do is shut down those factories that create these rifles, thereby severely decreasing the supply of such guns. You suggested that a black market might resort to smuggling weapons into the U.S. from other countries. However, as it is, our neighbors Canada and Mexico already have strict gun laws, and Mexico actually smuggles over half of its assault rifles from the United States, not to it. Because there would not be a steady supply chain, it's a pretty safe bet that an assault rifle black market would not take off nearly to the extent that the illicit drug market has. So what would this mismatch between demand and decreased supply due to the price and availability of assault rifles? Well, assault rifles prices would increase dramatically. While it's anyone's guess, it's not out of the question that prices could rise anywhere from 2 to 4 times their current price. Imagine if an AR-15 that's currently $1,000 at Cabela were $4,000 on the black market. Already, this is a serious deterrent to any would-be mass murderer, many of whom are young adults without a whole lot of cash. Also, the fact that there was a black market would require a potential customer to have connections to it. Since many mass murderers have been shy and reclusive individuals, there's a good chance they would not even have access to such a black market if it did exist. In summary, while an assault weapons ban could create a black market for guns, that market would likely be small, unsustainable, expensive, and not readily accessible to the majority of the people who pose the biggest threats to our safety. There are many sports and pastimes that are regulated in this country, and it only makes sense that the higher potential there is to do harm, the more care should be spent making sure this regulation is adequate, but not excessive. Regulations on things like gambling, alcohol, and cars can cause some to find decreased enjoyment in those things, but I truly believe that those are small sacrifices when compared to that of a human life. Finally, I'd like to point out that an assault weapons ban would not impede on citizens' rights to protect themselves and their families from thieves and burglars and whatnot. The most common and versatile form of personal protection is a handgun, and not an assault rifle. And handguns are just as effective at deterring criminals in most circumstances.
The only thing I want to respond to what he just said is keeping weapons out of the hands of criminals. And if everyone has to apply for a license, your license could just as easily be revoked as it could be given. So if you have a serious psychological issue, as some of these people did, they could revoke your license and you would not be able to even purchase a firearm of any type. And so that solves the problem in theory. And I think that's an easy step that we can easily implement. But again, the problem will not solve itself. People are still going to get their hands on weapons if they want to get their hands on weapons. So what I meant by that approach to psychiatrics is that it needs to be a double-sided approach. While we need to have laws to try to prevent people from gaining weapons, a determined person will always be able to gain a weapon. So we need to look at why people want to initiate these sorts of killings as opposed to 20 years ago when this kind of thing was unheard of. And I think a part of the problem is psychiatrics, but the other thing I mentioned was the media, and the media plays a huge part of this.
Unfortunately, there's no perfect solution. All we can do is try to create measures to make it more difficult for these things to happen. Obviously, it's not going to be perfect. It's not going to solve every problem, but you might save a couple lives down the road, and for me, I think it would be worth it.
Right. I mean, would you agree that the media is a huge problem?
Yeah, of course.
I mean, that's really what's least talked about, which is probably the most important factor in the entire issue of mass shootings. Not about gun control, because when you're talking about gun control, the thing that brings up gun control are mass shootings. People, there's not some guy in Texas who accidentally shoots himself, and that brings up the debate of gun control. The debate of gun control is brought up because there's a mass shooting. And the reason that these mass shootings occur is because people are looking for fame and infamy, and they're given it by the media, and that's the problem.
Thank you for joining us on our first episode of Political Myths Debunked. I was your host, Red Idaho, and if you have any interest in the topics that are related to the economy, education, psychiatrics, or anything that was mentioned on this episode, feel free to comment below and we'll look at them.